Hi, I'm Ebony Love. Today's video is on the Studio Take 5 die. The Take 5 pattern consists of an 8.5-inch square, a 4.5 by 8.5-inch rectangle, and 3 4.5-inch squares. And those are unfinished sizes. The traditional Take 5 pattern was developed to use 5/8 yards of 5 different fabrics cut into these different squares. Now, because we're die cutting, we do need to use just slightly more fabric for a couple of reasons. One, when you typically buy fabric off the bolt, it's not folded straight, first of all. And a lot of times when you're getting it cut at the craft store or the local quilt shop, they're not necessarily taking into account the fact that the fabric is not square. So if you get exactly 5/8 of a yard cut, that's not necessarily going to give you 5/8 usable fabric. So I actually recommend that you get 2/3 of a yard at a minimum, and that extra 1.5 inches is going to give you room to square up your fabrics. I have here a selection of 5 different fabrics, so you do need 5 fabrics for this pattern. You can use fewer fabrics, but you won't get as much variation in the pattern, and certainly you can use more fabrics than that if you want. With my 2/3 of a yard, I pressed the fabric and I squared up both edges, and then I cut a 14-inch width by the length of the fabric. I did not remove my selvages. One thing that you want to do if you are planning to remove your selvages is you need to make sure that you're left with at least 42 inches of length. So just be really careful when you're using that fabric if you're trying to save selvages, that you leave yourself enough room. So again, I cut a 14-inch width from my 2/3 of a yard, and then from the remaining length, I cut a 9-inch strip. Okay? We'll get to that 9-inch strip in a second. Now, the way that this is laid out, we're really going to be able to optimize our cuts here, and we're going to get from our 2/3 of a yard, we're going to get 4 of these blocks. So let me go through the cutting instructions first. So I have laid out some registration marks on my die. As always, I have outlined the die shape with a silver Sharpie. That's both because it shows up really well in the video, and also because I can see where the blades are on the die so I can align my fabric properly. I've also drawn 2 perpendicular lines which are positioned 1/4 of an inch away from the furthermost edge of the shape. And if you see on this die that the squares are about a 1/2 inch longer in total than the 2 squares on top, and that's because of the seam allowances. So just to optimize my cutting, I'm always going to cut 14-inch wide lengths here, even though I might be able to get away with 13.5 of the top. So it's just easier to use 14-inch lengths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fabrics, and from 42 inches in width, I can actually accordion fold or fan fold my fabric on the die and get 3 repeats. So you can stack your fabric on top of one another. So as I lay this out, you'll see me accommodating the selvage, which I did not remove, so I want to make sure that I'm not cutting the selvage in this block, and I'm just going to move some of this so you can see what I'm doing here. So again, this is with the 14-inch width, and I'm using my registration lines to line this up. I can stack a couple more on here if I want. The maximum that you'll be able to stack on top of here is actually 3 fabrics because of the accordion folding. So I'm just gently adjusting my layers here to make sure they're flat, so I'll take one more. And again, if you have not removed your selvages, you just want to make sure that you're not cutting the selvage with this first shape. Okay, and the reason I go to the trouble of lining these all up, making sure that my fabric follows the angle of the die blades and not the board itself, is because I want all my squares to be cut on grain. And making sure I have several videos that talk about how to straighten your fabric, how to align it on the die, so that you're always getting straight cuts, particularly for squares. Now with those 3 layers, I'm going to come back this direction, and what you may want to do is actually draw another perpendicular line, or a parallel line, I'm sorry, on this edge of the die to make sure that you are covering the die. I'm just eyeballing it here as I go back in this direction. And notice I just took all 3 of those layers and flipped them back in this direction. So I am accordioning these, if accordioning is a word, I'm folding these all together instead of individually. So one more time, back in this direction, and again, you want to make sure that your layers are even. So I'm not really tugging on these, I'm just kind of using my fingernails to straighten them and just making sure that they follow the registration marks that I have lined up here. So my layers got just a little bit out of whack here, so I'm going to straighten that up and make sure that nothing's peeking under the back. So this might be a little too fussy to demonstrate in a video, but this is what everybody has to do at home, right? Alright, so we get that flip back the other direction here. So now that is a total of 9 layers. 9 layers, and your studio will cut a maximum of 10 layers. So this is perfect. And I'm just pulling that back a little bit here to meet my line and make sure that's straight and all the edges are even. So once you have that, I use my studio for storage too. You want to lay the mat on top, and I'm going to run this through with the folded edge is leading. This is the narrowest part of the die, and so I'm just going to run this through the cutter, and I'll be right back. Okay, with that run through the cutter, I can now take off my mat, and hopefully I did use a new mat here, so I'm hoping I don't have too many threads caught in here. But here's my stack of 4.5 inch squares coming off of the cutter. So I've got just a couple of straight threads here that I want to clip. So I'm pulling that off. And then, so those were the smaller squares. And here's my larger square coming off here. So that's my larger set. This is the 8.5 inch square. And then these are my 8.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles. So that's one pass. So what you'll want to do is, with your remaining 2 fabrics, assuming that with that pass you cut the first 3, so with the remaining 2 14 inch by 42 approximately lengths, you're going to do the exact same thing and run those back through the cutter. I'm going to skip that step just to save a little bit of time here so that I can show you some of the other things here. And I will, because these are larger pieces, I will cut these off and save them for my scrappy back, which I love to do scrappy backs, and that's almost exclusively what I do these days. So let's talk about this other length of fabric, which is 9 inches wide, and of course if you got the 2/3 of a yard, then you'll have probably an inch left over. So depending on if you make string quilts or something, you can save that or use it in a backing or for another project. So you're 9 inches wide by 42 inches long, so this is still folded in half. What I want you to do is actually take that and subcut it into 2 14 inch long pieces so that you have a 9 by 14. You have 2 of those that are 9 by 14, and then you'll have an extra piece here. And we do not need this piece for the Take 5 pattern, so you can set that aside. And again, for me, it's not a problem because I'm going to do a scrappy back. So with those two 14-inch by 9-inch pieces, I'm actually going to lay one of those pieces, which you can see here. One of those is going to go on top of the large 8.5-inch square and the 8.5 by 4.5-inch triangle. And then the other one we're going to lay on the side and let that hang off the edge of the die. And you're going to slightly overlap these here in the center just to make sure that the blades are covered. So I've turned one piece upside down so that you can see this. I've slightly overlapped my pieces, and because this piece is wider than those 3 squares, then it's just going to, you'll have that extra hanging over. If you want to, you could subcut that second rectangle into a 5-inch strip, but I just left it just for time purposes. Okay, so I'm going to just stack a couple more of those because I had them cut previously. So I don't have all of them cut, but again, you want one of them goes over the big square, and then the other one goes over the little square. And so this is how we're really going to optimize our Take 5 pattern. So let me run that through the cutter quickly here. And I just stuff that extra fabric underneath the roller as it passes, just being careful that it doesn't get grabbed in a strange way by the die as it's cutting and going through there. All right. So with those pieces, so now again, I've got these smaller squares. And I do have a couple of strings still cut there. So that comes off. And then I end up with these large pieces, which are again going in my scrappy back. And then this rectangle yields a fairly little scrap. And there you have it. So that's how you would use this Take 5 die in a nutshell. Now once you have gotten all those cut, you really are just mixing these up so that you have one of each fabric in each block. So there's 5 pieces in each block and you use 5 fabrics. So if you just mix them up in a somewhat random fashion, you'll be able to make this pattern. So I really hope that that was useful for you and instructional. I do have more videos on my YouTube channel, which is LoveBug Studios. Thanks and happy quilting!